The Skippetty Shoes. Mr. Winkle was a shoemaker. He lived in a tiny, tumble-down cottage. All day long, he sat outside on a bench and made or mended shoes. He was a merry, mischievous fellow, always ready for a joke. Sometimes he played naughty tricks and made his friends cross. One time, Winkle put a squeak into the heels of some boots he sold to Dame Twisty. And when she heard the squeak, squeak, squeak as she walked, she thought it was a goblin coming after her. Winkle got worse as he grew older. One morning, as he sat mending shoes and humming a little song that went, "Told the races for a fade, told the races for a gnome," a fat gnome came by. He stood and watched Winkle at work. Winkle looked up and grinned. "You've a lot of time to waste," Winkle said cheekily. The gnome frowned. He felt in his bag and brought out a pair of old shoes, each of which had a hole in the sole. They had once been grand shoes, for there was a gold buckle on each, and the heels were made of silver. "How long will it take to mend these?" asked the gnome. "1 hour," answered Winkle. "My, how grand they were once, but they're very old now and hardly worth mending." "They are most comfortable shoes," said the gnome. "And that is why they are to be mended, Mr. Winkle. Now set to work and keep your tongue still. It wags all day long." "Better than growling all day long like yours," answered Winkle cheekily. Mr. Winkle felt annoyed. An idea came into his naughty mind. He would take a trick on the gnome. He got a little Skippetty spell. It was tucked inside a milk jug. He hurried back into his bench and found the gnome looking crossly at him. Winkle sewed quickly at the shoes. Into each he sewed half of the Skippetty spell, grinning to himself as he thought of how the gnome would kick, jump, leap, and prance as soon as he put those shoes on his feet. "Ho ho! That would be a funny sight to watch." At last the shoes were finished. Mr. Winkle handed it to the gnome and took his payment. But still, the old fellow sat there on the stool, as if he were waiting for someone. "What are you waiting for?" asked Winkle. "The king is coming to call for me here," said the gnome. "It is his shoes you have mended for." Winkle stared in horror. Gracious goodness! Were they really the king's own shoes? He was just going to take them from the gnome when there came the sound of galloping hooves and up the king's carriage. The gnome stood up and gave the shoes to the king. His Majesty kicked off his grand old boots and slipped his feet contentedly into his old shoes. "Oh, how nice to have this again," he began, and then he stopped in dismay. As soon as they were on the king's feet, the Skippetty spell began to work, and what a shock they gave His Majesty. They jumped him out of the carriage. They made him kick his legs up to the air. His crown fell into a lavender bush, and his cloak was shaken all crooked. He pranced round the garden. He kicked high, he kicked low. He jumped over the wall, and he spun round and round till he was quite giddy. "What have you done to the king's shoes?" shouted the gnome. "There's a Skippetty spill in them," stammered Winkle. "Do you know how to get it out?" "I don't." Luckily, the old gnome was a clever fellow, and he knew how to deal with the Skippetty spell. He clapped his hands 7 times, called out a strange magic word, and presto, the spell flew out of the shoes. They stopped dancing, and the king sat down to get his breath. Mr. Winkle knelt down and begged the king's pardon, but he was far too angry to listen. "Take your tools and go away from fairyland," roared the king. "I've a good mind to turn you into an earwig. Go away before I think of the right word." Winkle was in terrible fright. He ran until he came to the borders of fairyland. Now he lives in our world. He still makes shoes for the pixies, very tiny ones, gold and black. The end.